Bokeh or bokeh, however you want to pronounce it. It is the English word that comes from Japanese that means blur. Now, a lot of people think that it just means what you're seeing on the video screen right here, which is these big circles of light that happen with a very shallow depth of field. Technically, it's really just the quality of blur. It's just the blur that you get for whatever is out of focus. Now, even more technically, what's happening with what you're seeing here is it's the reflection of light points on the image plane of your camera. Now, I don't know all of the technical aspects of it. It's a little bit too scientific for me, but what's happening is when points of light reflect into your camera, it creates these circles. Now, depending on the shape of your aperture, which is inside of your lens, those circles are going to have a different shape. So here we are with a 56mm prime at an f1.2 with a wide open aperture where super wide open aperture, the hole inside your lens is a big circle. The blades of your aperture are wide open, and so there's not too much of the edges that you might see with a closed down aperture. But with a wider open aperture, you also get the most significant bokeh effect, which we'll use that term for these light points hitting our camera right here. Now let's see how those circles change as we go through different apertures. I am locked down on my camera. I have my ISO and shutter speed set to auto, so the exposure should stay relatively similar as I go through the apertures. So I'm at 1.2, now 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2.0. And now at 2.0, you can really start to see the hexagonal shape of the bokeh in the background. And that's because with the closed down aperture, those blades are getting smaller inside of your lens. And if you have a manual aperture lens, you can even see this if you take your lens off your camera and close down your aperture and open it up. You can see that circle or that opening closing and opening, and you can see the blades shutting it down. So if we go even farther to 2.5, 2.8, 3.2, 3.6, it gets even more pronounced. But if we go too far, if we keep going 4.0, 4.5, all the way, closing it down to f11, f8, f11, then you really start to lose that effect, that bokeh effect that we typically think of. So the first rule of thumb is if you want more of that effect, you want a wider open aperture. Now let's swap to another lens to see how a different lens might look differently. All right, so now I'm on my 80mm prime lens. I'm at the same position, so I have a tighter shot on our subject Bill here. And you can see that the light in the background, it has even bigger circles in the background, and that's because we're a little bit tighter. So another rule of thumb is that if you want more pronounced bokeh, you zoom in or use a more telephoto lens. Now I was at a f2.8, which is the widest open it goes, and as I go to f4.0, 5.6, f8, f11, you can see again that the bokeh effect starts to lose the shape, and there's a sweet spot right around there for this lens that was right around f5.6. Now let's swap over to the Fuji 16mm lens. So obviously the framing is completely different, and you just don't get that same effect. So with a wider lens, it's just going to be more difficult to get that effect with a wide shot. In a second, we'll move this setup closer so that we can see if we can get a similar effect at all. But as I change the aperture, you can see that it's really difficult to tell what's going on in the background. So I've moved everything closer, and now you can kind of start to see that effect. You still get a nice little bokeh effect with the points of light in the background. And so with a wider lens, you might have to actually move things closer to the background and compress that depth of field manually by moving yourself closer to that background. When the background's too far away from a wide lens, it's just not going to look as good, depending on what your preference is, of course. And as I go through my aperture f-stops, you can see that it changes subtly in the background. And with a wider open aperture, the points of light get rounder and a little bit bigger. So the takeaways, if you're going for this bokeh effect of having these big balls and circles in the background, one is you really need specific light sources, pinpoints of light in the background, whether it's holiday lights like this, street lights out at night, or even sometimes you get this effect when you're photographing in front of a tree or plants and the sunlight is coming through the small spots in between the leaves. But it's going to be most pronounced when you're shooting in a darker setup with smaller points of light like this. You also want to open up your aperture as wide as you can to get the biggest circles, or a little bit smaller f-stop or aperture rather if you want more hexagonal shaped, or depending on the size and shape of your lens. And then lastly, using a more telephoto lens or zooming in with your lens to compress that background with your lens will help. Otherwise, you're going to have to compress it by moving your subject closer to the lights if you have a wider angle lens. All right, I really hope this breakdown of bokeh helps you understand what it is, how it gets its shape. Let me know in the comments if you learned something new, or if this has helped you out, or if there's something I missed. I know there's going to be a debate whether we should pronounce it bokeh or bokeh, but at the end of the day, I just want to help you understand photography a little bit better. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in another lesson. Have a beautiful day.